Hello, listeners, from Roy Damari of InSam. This week I'm going to begin, at the end of the talk about the finance markets, I'm going to begin a mention of how Russia won its East as distinct from America winning its West. But that'll be in a few minutes' time. First, I'd like to mention that we have an extremely delicate situation in world economics and politics. We have, of course, the threat of military action by the US and indeed in the UK in Syria, which won't exactly improve relations with Russia, but at least will make the point that you can't get away with poisoning people quite so easily as the Syrians seem to think it. However, I won't emit too much of an opinion on that. It's a little bit outside the scope of our broadcast. I think of greater concern is the beginning of a trade war with China, and indeed the performance of the stock market these days seems to depend on whether people believe the trade war will actually happen or whether the two countries involved will find a solution which will avoid them blocking each other's trade. So that's the most powerful force acting in the short term on the stock market. And it goes up and down literally from day to day as a function of who is the more bellicose in the conversations between the two countries. In the meantime, the American economy, upon which we are all so dependent, is allegedly overheating because the unemployment has gone right down, and they're beginning to think at the level of the Fed that inflation will go up, and therefore they have to increase the Fed rate, the short-end rate of the yield curve, even more quickly, not more slowly, but more quickly than they have been envisaging. Yet the long end is not going up with it. And that is really an issue which we have to watch very carefully, because when you have an inverted yield curve, and it is inverted actually in the first few months or year or two of the curve, but if it's inverted over the long run, then it does actually mean very bad news in terms of economic development. As you know, because there's a possibility that the long end will not go up at the rate the Fed probably would like to see it, means that going long in bonds is not such a bad idea. In fact, when I was at Bridport, we learnt about barbells, and that meant that investors in bond or bond-like instruments would do well to be very short. That's almost in the money market, which may be coming back into use, or very long, but nothing in the middle. So that is an issue. They will raise the rates because I don't think they believe that the external factors are more important than the internal overheating factors. My warning on this is that if you cut taxes and let your government go massively into debt, increasing debt, because it's not collecting enough taxes for its expenditure, that money is going to go into purchasing consumer goods, and that will have two short-term impacts. It will increase inflation, and it will increase the trade gap. But in the long run, if a government is too much in the red, and the US government will be in the red even more after the Trump tax cuts, then a bigger problem will arise and the whole thing will go awry. That we have to watch with great care, because I do not believe that the current economic policies, never mind politics, just pure economic policies of the USA are actually inappropriate. Now, it's ironic, isn't it, that the struggle with Russia over the poisoning and Syria and so on is straining the relationships between the governments, but not, I hope, between the people. And Russian history is still a matter of great interest, particularly in view, for myself, of the book which I'm now reading by Eric Hersley, which is in French, and it's called L'Épopée Sibérienne, which means something like the Siberian Epic. And the idea is to to say, well, we have this epic of how the West was won in the USA, and now we're talking about how the East was won in Russia, although that whole story is sort of unknown. I intend to add to each of my weekly broadcasts about finance or anything else just a little bit of what I learn as I plough through, it is rather long, the book by Eric Hersley. And the starting point I gave you last week or the week before was that the basic Siberian land was, quote, conquered, close quote, by Russians instead of the local indigenous populations because of trapping and catching animals for their fur. And that's true. However, the first step goes back before that, and we have to look at a family called Stroganoff. Now, you've all heard of Birth Stroganoff. Apparently, it doesn't really go right back to the Stroganoffs I'm going to talk about now, but was invented in Russia in the early 1800s. And there are two Stroganoff descendants who claim it's their name that was taken to render beef stroganoff or Birth Stroganoff popular, and it's very popular in the USA as well. Now, that's almost irrelevant because the person who is most important in terms of this opening up of Siberia is a certain Annika Stroganoff. Now, Annika was a man, and some idiot wrote on the web that it was a she because Annika sounds like a girl's name, but it isn't. It's the short form of Yona, and he was the first oligarch. He was rich, and he had influence over the court. Now, his town or city, Solvyshedosk, was a long way, but still in European Russia, from Moscow. Not so far that the trip there and back was impossible in the 16th century, but far enough for it not to be under strict control from Moscow. It's within range, it's about halfway in fact, between Moscow and the Ural Mountains, and the Ural was the border of Russia for all practical purposes in the 16th century. Now, the Tsar we're talking about now is Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, and he was slightly maniacal. He killed his own son, after all, in a rage. He had the most appalling secret police that went around actually murdering people left, right and centre. But Annika Stroganoff was far enough away from that to be pretty safe in terms of the bad guys coming and stealing and killing from him. Annika lived actually from 1488 to 1570. But the big thing he did was start salt mining. Now, that's astonishing, isn't it? Today, we don't think of salt as being much of a big deal, but then it was. Salt was very expensive. It had to be brought in from abroad. But he discovered salt on the banks of the river, I think the River Kama, which actually runs through Udmurtia, which I visit from time to time. And he started salt mining in 1515. And he became very wealthy, and that meant that he could have lots of land and serfs and even have his own soldiers. And finally, he actually went to ask the Tsar to grant him all rights and privileges on the land from Solvyshedosk to the Ural Mountains. And then he developed all sorts of salt mines in that area, becoming ever richer, and in exchange for this deal with Ivan the Terrible, he provided Ivan with soldiers to help keep at bay on the west the Swedes and on the south the Tatars. So Ivan was under enormous military pressure, and he didn't have enough soldiers or enough money to defend the country, and that's where Annika Stroganoff got his best deal. Now, that story will go on because he then had sons, which went even further in terms of taking over things. It wasn't all easy for them. It wasn't a bed of roses at all. And indeed, dealing with Ivan the Terrible was considered to be extremely difficult and dangerous, because he could just as easily lose his temper with you and have you basically, killed or punished in some way. So that's the story so far. And I think each week I will add a little bit more as we gradually move out from, short of the Urals to the Urals and then beyond. And it's interesting, it does go back to the middle of the 16th century. So do listen to me each week and I'll help you understand what I think is a fascinating subject, which is how the East was won.